Hello, I'm Natalie Zett, and welcome to Flower in the River. This podcast, inspired by my book of the same name, explores the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago and its enduring impact, particularly on my family's history. We'll explore the intertwining narratives of others impacted by this tragedy as well. And we'll dive into writing and genealogy and uncover the surprising supernatural elements that surface in family history research. Come along with me on this journey of discovery. Hey everyone, so we are coming up on the big day. It's almost the 109th anniversary of the Eastland disaster. I know. Every episode of this podcast is kind of like a little tribute to what happened back then, but reaching that 109-year mark, it feels like a good time to hit pause and chat about it. You know how birthdays make you think about the past year? It's kind of like that. Let's take a quick look at what has been covered so far and maybe get an idea of where we're headed. No guarantees on that, by the way. All right, so let's take a little trip down memory lane. Since last November, I've been digging into the stories of some very amazing people and communities who are tied to the Eastland disaster. And let me tell you, it has been quite the ride. And you know what I realized? There are so many stories out there tucked away in old documents, in old newspapers, and forgotten corners. Most of them haven't been dusted off and shared in years. I still can't believe this. And all these incredible tales just waiting to be told. I wonder, what are they waiting for? They're not waiting. It's just that they have needed a willing vehicle to transport them to present time. Before we go walking down memory lane, I have some super exciting news to share. Remember Tom Milton and that letter from Willard Hayes, MD, that we talked about in episode 69 about the actor and the doctor? Well, guess what? The photo, the news clipping, and the amazing letter from Dr. Haynes are on their way to their forever home at the Newberry Library in Chicago. How cool is that? This previously untold story lurking around on eBay is going to be preserved, cared for, and available for anyone who wants to learn more. Big shout out to the folks at the Newberry. You all rock. Now, here's something else that totally blew my mind. I was poking around on the various Eastland disaster memorials on Find a Grave. I've talked about that quite a bit, but I wanted to cross check and error check for this episode. And holy smokes, you wouldn't believe how many of the Eastland disaster victims now have detailed, source cited biographies with their names and photos. That was not there just a few months ago. And I know that because I do a lot of screenshots of what I find and what's lacking, and kind of like it's like a cookbook waiting for a recipe to be filled in, if you will. But now I can throw a lot of those old files away because you filled them in. And whether you've been inspired by this podcast or there's something in the air pushing you to go the extra mile and do this, I'm just grateful. And I want to say thank you for actively helping to preserve this history. And by the way, I just did a cursory tally on individuals that I've covered since November 2023. And there are about 102, 103, and that's roughly 10 to 12% of who I think still needs to be covered for these Eastland Chronicle stories. So I've got some work ahead of me. But for a second, just a second, let's be real. We're probably never going to get the full scope on everyone involved in this story. And I'm talking about the survivors, the witnesses, those everyday heroes who stepped up when it mattered. And yeah, even the folks who took advantage of the chaos. And I'm looking at you, Arthur Loeb. But you know what? I do think that all of these people want to be remembered. I do. I have had way too many, whoa, what are the odds moments while digging up these stories. And that started way back over 25 years ago with my great aunt. And it continues every time I look at the Eastland disaster and ask who wants their story told. I no longer shrug this stuff off or dismiss it. It's kind of like they really do want these stories shared. And the tales of individuals in tragedies such as the Eastland disaster, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and the General Slocum are pitifully underrepresented. And time is not on our side, as I've said. Every moment that passes, more of this history fades away. My goal is to keep researching and keep sharing these stories and do as much as I can and share these stories with you each week. I only have about 90% to go, so I'm good. But first, here are the people and the communities that I've covered on Flower in the River podcast, November 4th, 2023 to July 14th, 2024. We are remembering them today on the 109th anniversary of the Eastland disaster. From Cemetery to Courtroom, the Eastland Aftermath, November 4th, 2023. This episode shed light on the deaths of William Ristow and his brother Herman, whose survivors pursued justice through a civil court case in 1934. Imagine the courtroom drama as surviving members fought for their loved ones' memory and legacy nearly 2 decades after the disaster. I have to say that this story was the wake up call for me, and it demonstrated not just the ripples of the Eastland disaster, but how much had not been told. After the Eastland, Shadow over Polish Chicago was published on November 11th, 2023. This episode took us on a journey into the heart of Polish Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. It's the story of a vibrant community, but one that was deeply affected by this tragedy. This was the first time I really stepped back to look at the various ethnic communities in early 1900s Chicago. To be honest, I didn't know that much about them outside of my family, and I knew that I had to do some very deep research here. And what I found was eye-opening and complex. Back then, in the early 1900s, your ethnicity and your religion weren't just a part of your identity, they shaped nearly every aspect of your life. And here's something even more fascinating. Within the larger Polish community, and I think you could say that about any ethnic or religious community, there were all kinds of smaller sub communities, and each one had its own unique characteristics. And it's a reminder of just how diverse and intricate we are as human beings. And when we come together in a community, even within that community, we share certain things, but we also are very different as individuals. But the story of Polish Chicago takes on a somber turn when we consider the Eastland disaster because it hit the Polish community particularly hard, with each family bearing its own unique grief. In this episode, we met stepsisters Eva Wodki and Benedicta Svitala, along with their parents, John Svitala and Carolina Wodki Svitala. The heartbreak also extends to their surviving sister, Martha Wodke Proszowska, and Emma Jasko and Karl Knopf also perished. Their intertwined lives and losses paint a vivid picture of a community shattered but not broken. Rekindling roots, cousin connection, survivor saga rediscovered, gripping Eastland documentary. This was November 18th, 2023. Holy smokes, got a lot into that one, didn't we? But for this discussion, I want to focus on James Gardner. He was a man who wore two hats on that fateful day, both as survivor and rescuer. Gardner left us with a powerful legacy, a letter to the editor of the Galena Daily Gazette, that's Illinois. It was penned on July 27th, 1915. This is just 3 days after the Eastland disaster, so keep that in mind. And this isn't just any letter. It's a raw, emotional time capsule that takes us right back into the heart of the disaster. Through Gardner's words, we get to experience the courage and chaos of that day through the eyes of someone who actually lived it. Eastland Chronicles, Catherine McIntyre's bravery didn't stop with survival. November 22nd, 2023. Catherine McIntyre's story is one of extraordinary bravery. Surviving the Eastland was just the beginning for her. Catherine actually rescued her mother and brother on that day, but Catherine's life post Eastland was one of continual service and purpose. Legacy of the Lost, Uncovering the Eastland's Hidden Stories. This is December 2nd, 2023, and we turn to the Legacy of the Lost, where we look at the lives of Otto Brandt, the brother and main support of Mary Brach, after she lost her husband and 5 children. And we look at Robert Magnuson, who lost his wife and 2 children. Their stories, alongside those of journalist Richard Henry Little and political cartoonist John Tinney McCutcheon, highlight the powerful role of media in shaping public perception and memory of the disaster. Beyond the Titanic, the Eastland love story of George and Teresa, December 9th, 2023. This episode takes us back to a love story that predates the Titanic's mythical Jack and Rose and carries as much heart and heartbreak. Meet George Dobeck and Teresa Danda, whose tale reminds us that behind the Eastland disaster's statistics were real people with hopes, dreams, and romances tragically cut short. But our story doesn't end there. We also remember Eddie Danda and Martha Pfeiffer, 2 more lives caught in the disaster's grip. These names once graced the front page of the Chicago Herald under the ominous missing category. Though they were eventually found, it was a grim discovery that only deepened the tragedy. Through these intertwined stories, we get a glimpse of the very real, very human cost of the Eastland disaster, and it's a stark reminder that each number in the death toll represents a full life of connections, potential, and love, all lost in a single terrible moment. Eastland Waters, Melody, Verse, and Lithuanian Legacy in Chicago. This was December 16th, 2023. In this episode, we dive into the heart of Chicago's Lithuanian community. We'll remember the following lives, and I'm going to have to pronounce these very slowly and carefully because my Lithuanian has not improved all that much since December. So we have Josephine Roshinsky, Boleslavas Civikas, Kotrina Kaspareti, and Petronella Larinashute. Each name a story, each name a thread in the fabric of their community. But in this episode, we didn't just look into the past. We also met Robertas Seminoukoyas, a contemporary voice from the folk rock band Žalvarinis. His music served as a cultural bridge, connecting us to the heritage of those affected by the disaster and adding a unique dimension to our understanding of its impact. And to cap it off, I ended with the haunting poem, Eastland Waters by Agnes Lee. Her words helped us feel the weight of this tragedy across the years. Next episode, Curveballs and Calamities. Eastland Disaster Baseball Connection, December 23rd, 2023. Step up to the plate for this episode, where we swing into a uniquely American angle of the Eastland disaster. Baseball. We remembered the amateur and semi-professional ball players who lost their lives in the tragedy, along with some of their family members. Our lineup includes John Farmer Freilich, his wife Jadwiga, and her sister Zimna. We also remembered Harold Meyer, Albert Kennedy, Morris Roble, Frank Rehor, Charles Bloch, George Bennett, Arthur Locke, and Henry Schutte. These players never made it to the big leagues, but their stories are just as important. Through their lives, we saw how the disaster touched every corner of Chicago life, even America's favorite pastime. From coal dust to river depths, Spring Valley's Eastland Story, December 29th, 2023. In this episode, we journeyed into the coal mining town of Spring Valley, Illinois, where the Eastland disaster cast a long shadow. We uncovered how this tight-knit community, already familiar with the dangers of the earth, was struck by tragedy from the water. We focused on the Tice sisters, Clara and Agnes, who lost their lives, and Harriet, who survived to tell the tale. Their story gave us a glimpse into the hopes and dreams that brought these young women from their small town to that fateful day in Chicago. We also met Leonard Winsky and the Summit siblings, Walter and Nellie. Their journey from the coal must of Spring Valley to the murky depths of the Chicago River is both heartbreaking and captivating. Through these interconnected lives, we explored how the Eastland disaster reached way beyond Chicago's borders, forever changing this one small Illinois town. The Synchronicities and age-old premonitions of the Eastland disaster, January 6, 2024. I have to admit, this is one of my favorite topics. And this spine-tingling episode uncovered the realm of premonitions and uncanny coincidences surrounding the Eastland disaster. We took a look at three victims whose stories were intertwined with eerie foreshadowing and chilling omens. First, there was Hedwig Hattie Steffen, whose tale might make you wonder about fate's mysterious ways. Then, Edna Will Pinkall. Her story could give you goosebumps. And let's not forget Josephine Roshinsky, who we mentioned previously, whose life seemed marked by foreboding signs. These weren't mythical ghost stories. They were real accounts of people whose lives ended that fateful day. But here's the thing, the events leading up to their tragic demise might make you question the line between coincidence and premonition. This explores the darker, more mysterious side of the Eastland disaster, reminding us, as it often does, that truth is stranger than fiction. Shadows of the Past, Premonitions from the Titanic to the Eastland. This was January 13th, 2024. Continuing with the theme of premonitions, we analyzed the lives of survivor Annie Utz, victim Annie Booth, and the R.L. Clark family, parents and a baby daughter. Their stories, along with those of Oliver J. Buford and Nellie Fitzgerald, revealed the uncanny connections between two maritime disasters. That would be the Titanic and the Eastland disaster. Tarzan's Chicago adventure. Eastland survivor faces second maritime disaster, January 21st, 2024. In a twist straight out of a Hollywood script, Eastland disaster survivor Gertrude Brandt faced another maritime disaster alongside Johnny Weissmuller, better known as Tarzan. Her harrowing escape from the Favorite capsizing in 1927 is a tale of resilience, not to mention second chances. A switchboard operator and a nurse walk into a shipwreck, unraveling the Eastland disaster. This is January 27th, 2024. This episode shines a spotlight on two unsung heroes of the Eastland disaster, Margaret Condon and Helen Repa. When chaos erupted, these women didn't hesitate to step up. Margaret Condon, a switchboard operator, found herself at the heart of the communications storm. Margaret's quick thinking and steady hands played a crucial role in coordinating rescue efforts. Meanwhile, Helen Repa, a nurse, dove headfirst into the mayhem. Her medical skills and cool head under pressure saved lives in those critical moments. Through their stories, we get a glimpse of the often overlooked heroes who emerged in the wake of the tragedy. These women remind us that in times of crisis, ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights. Their bravery and quick actions stand as a testament to the human spirit in the face of disaster. Coroner's Conundrum, Peter Hoffman and the Eastland disaster, February 3rd, 2024. This episode puts the spotlight on a key figure in the Eastland disaster's grim aftermath. Coroner Pete Hoffman. As the man tasked with making sense of the tragedy's toll, Hoffman found himself at the epicenter of heartbreak and chaos. We investigate Hoffman's story, exploring the monumental task he faced. Through Hoffman's experience, we get a behind the scenes look at the often overlooked challenges that follow the disaster. From managing overcrowded morgues to the painstaking process of identification, his story reveals the complex and emotional work of bringing closure to a community torn apart by tragedy. From the Mayflower to the Sketchpad, unveiling more Eastland connections. This was February 11th, 2024. Not all Eastland passengers were working class immigrants. Leslie Simmons, a photographer with Mayflower roots, and political cartoonist Bob Satterfield add a surprising twist to our understanding of the disaster's diverse victims. leafing through history, Oak Park, Forest Park, and the Eastland. This is from February 17th, 2024. This episode took us to the suburbs of Oak Park and Forest Park, Illinois, where we uncovered the interconnected stories of three Eastland disaster victims: Earl Dawson, Matthew Bonga, and Gertrude Stork. Their lives and losses painted a vivid picture of how the tragedy reached beyond Chicago's city limits. But the story didn't end there. We also explored the remarkable connection between Joseph Darby and Dr. Edward Buchan, two veterans of the Eastland disaster whose paths crossed years after that fateful day. Their shared experience of the tragedy forged an unexpected bond, highlighting how the disaster's impact echoed through time. Through these 5 lives, we saw how the Eastland disaster created a web of connections. Some tragically cut short, others unexpectedly formed. It's a poignant reminder of how a single event can ripple through communities across decades in ways that no one could have predicted back then, and I would add, even now. The Lutheran Legacy of the Eastland disaster. This was February 25th, 2024. This episode shines a light on the Lutheran communities affected by the Eastland disaster, revealing how tragedy struck at the heart of faith and family. We paid tribute to Augusta Schwan Vesey and her granddaughter, Elizabeth Rakow. Their story, a poignant reminder of how the disaster spanned generations. The Rossow family's tale is equally heart-wrenching, with William, Mamie, William Jr., and Ruth all lost to the waters that day. Through these families' experiences, we explored the profound impact the Eastland disaster had on one of Chicago's religious communities. We see how places of worship became centers of mourning and support, and how faith was both challenged and reinforced in the face of unimaginable loss. This episode offered a unique perspective on the disaster, showing how it rippled through the tight-knit Lutheran communities, forever altering the fabric of their congregations and testing the bonds of faith and family. Frida Kannberg's story and the legacy of the Eastland. This was March 2nd, 2024. Frida Kannberg's life and death on the Eastland are brought to life through historical documents and Western Electric Company news articles. Her story, along with those of her fellow committee members, bridges the past and present, emphasizing the emotional resonance of their legacies. Sons of Norway, Daughters of Tragedy, the Iverson family's Eastland story. This was March 9th, 2024. This episode takes us into the heart of Chicago's Norwegian American communities, focusing on the Iverson family and the profound impact the Eastland disaster had on their lives. We go into the stories of Louise Iverson Teal and Mabel Iverson Gibson, two sisters whose lives were tragically cut short. Their loss resonated not just within their immediate family, but throughout their tight-knit Norwegian community. Through the Iversons' experience, we gained insight into how immigrant families striving for the American dream found themselves caught in an unimaginable nightmare. We explored how the Norwegian heritage shaped their lives in Chicago and how the disaster forever altered the course of their family's history. This episode served as a poignant reminder that behind each name on the casualty list was a unique story, a family legacy, and a community forever changed. The Iversons' tale illustrates the far-reaching tendrils of tragedy, showing how the Eastland disaster touched lives across so many cultural backgrounds. Unearthing the Untold: Jewish Lives and the Eastland Tragedy, March 16th, 2024. This episode shines a light on the Jewish community affected by the Eastland disaster, focusing on survivors and those who lost their lives. We uncover the stories of individuals like Jack Elleen and Carl Friedman, whose experiences offered a unique perspective on this tragedy. Through their narratives, we explore how the disaster impacted Chicago's diverse Jewish population. And this adds another layer to our understanding of the Eastland's far reaching effects. These personal accounts also remind us that the Eastland disaster touched lives across all of Chicago's communities, regardless of faith or background. And by examining these stories, we gain a more comprehensive picture of the tragedy's impact on the city's rich cultural tapestry. One note: before I began doing this research, based on what I had read until I started researching, I didn't think there were any Jewish people affected by the Eastland disaster. I know, but I thought that can't be right. And sure enough, there were quite a few families who were affected. Sassiness saved her. A Jewish girl's narrow escape from the Eastland. This was March 23rd, 2024. This episode continues the exploration of the Eastland disaster's impact on Chicago's Jewish communities, focusing on the stories of survival and loss. We meet Ruth Nadich, a vibrant personality whose quick thinking and high spirits likely saved not only her life, but her sister's as well. Ruth's story is a testament to how split-second decisions and a dash of luck could make all the difference in a day. We also remember Sam Widron and Celia Brooks Columbik, whose tragic fates underscore the devastating toll of the disaster. Their stories serve as a poignant reminder of all the lives cut short and all of those dreams that were left unfulfilled. Through these accounts, we gain insight into the stark contrast between survival and loss that defined that day. And we see how the Jewish community, like so many others in Chicago, found itself caught in the grip of an unthinkable situation, with some people emerging as survivors, while others were not so fortunate. This episode also highlights the arbitrary nature of fate during the Eastland disaster, reminding us of the profound impact it had on individuals, families, and an entire community. Archives Unveiled: The Eastland Disaster's Hidden Stories. I shared the wisdom from Mr. Schmidt, a man who lovingly tended the graves at our church's cemetery when I was growing up, and I also share the story of chronicler Reverend Gotthold Elbert, whose church, Grace Lutheran in Chicago, was dramatically impacted by the Eastland disaster. This was March 30th, 2024. Bonded in Tragedy: The Role of Fraternal Orders in the Eastland Disaster, April 6, 2024. So many Eastland victims and families were members of fraternal orders, and we mention Nelson and Roy Peterson, Louise Thompson, Peter Weth, Charles Pierce, and John Sweden, whose affiliations provided support and solidarity in the face of tragedy. Bloodlines and bylines. The power of genetic genealogy. This is April 13th, 2024. This episode was a bit of a departure because it focused on the latest findings in genetic genealogy, offering a deeper dive into ancestry and uncovering connections between Eastland victims and their descendants, of which I am one. Irish roots and Greek tides. More Eastland stories. This was April 20th, 2024, and I shared the story of young Mary Helen Egan of Chicago's Irish Catholic community and Theodore Hollis, a Greek immigrant. Both lost their lives on the Eastland, and Mary is going to make a very quick return visit in the next episode. Crowdsourcing the past, the Eastland tragedy, and collaborative genealogy. The return of Mary Helen Egan and her connection to the Dolezal, Wood, and Sindelar families. This blew my mind because these interconnected stories illustrated the power of understanding context and connection when researching the past. In other words, researching somebody individually without realizing who they were connected to beyond family. Again, we're going back to the fan approach, the family, friends, associates, and neighbors. Very important when researching something like the Eastland disaster. And it was very true here because I was able to link Mary Helen Egan and all of these other families. Threads of Tragedy. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and the Eastland Disaster. This was May 4th, 2024. What does an avoidable disaster in New York City have to do with the Eastland? Plenty, as I found out. We drew parallels between the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and the Eastland disaster, highlighting the shared experiences of young immigrant women. Undertaking Courage. Catherine Wyon's Eastland story. This is from May 11th, 2024. This episode brings to light a hidden gem unearthed from the Chicago Ancestors Database, and that is part of the Newberry, by the way. My research led to a fascinating discovery, the story of Catherine Wyand, quite possibly the only woman mortician involved in the Eastland disaster's aftermath. We explored Wyand's unique role in caring for Eastland victim Anna Brenner. This remarkable account not only illuminates an often overlooked aspect of the tragedy, but also showcases the pioneering women who were breaking professional barriers in the early 20th century. Wyand's story offers a new lens through which to view the complex and somber task of tending to the disaster's victims. It serves as a reminder of the many, many unsung heroes who stepped up in the wake of the Eastland disaster, each contributing their skills in unprecedented and deeply personal ways. Selfless saviors, two extraordinary rescuers in the Eastland disaster. This is from May 17th, 2024. We honor Fred Lippert and George Spiegelhauer, whose heroic efforts saved numerous lives during the Eastland disaster. Their selflessness is a shining example of humanity at its best. The Chronicler and the Rescuer, unveiling overlooked narratives. This is from May 26, 2024, featuring Harry Birch, a pioneering newsreel cameraman, and Frederick W. Willard, a hero who saved lives during the disaster. This episode uncovers more overlooked narratives that deserve recognition. From Hoboken to Hawthorne, Martha Willig's Untold Story. This is from June 1st, 2024. So, what I didn't realize is that many individuals from New Jersey and New York relocated to Chicago to work for Western Electric, including members of the Willig, Larson, and Cruz families. While researching, I discovered a story I'd never heard before in the Hudson Observer. This is New Jersey, dated July 28th, 1915, again 4 days after the Eastland disaster. This article reprinted a letter from Martha Willig to her sister, in which Martha detailed how she and several members of her party survived the Eastland disaster. Another letter writer. Rivers of Grief, Eastland and the General Slocum. This is from June 8th, 2024. This episode dives into the eerie connections between the Eastland disaster and the General Slocum tragedy, two devastating events with strikingly historical parallels. It features the story of Anna Hillman from Hoboken, New Jersey, who died on the Eastland, and it also tells the story of how a faulty alarm clock saved other New Jersey transplants from boarding the Eastland. From Tragedy to Transformation, the George Haas story. This is from June 16th, 2024. This is a commemoration of the Eastland disaster's sister tragedy, the General Slocum disaster, June 15th, 1904. This event focuses on one survivor, George Haas, whose life was irrevocably changed that day. Survived but not saved. The Lingering Legacy of the Eastland Disaster. This is from June 22nd, 2024. The story of Chrissy McNeil Lauritsen, a survivor of the Eastland disaster who suffered long-term health effects and eventually succumbed to them. Her story highlights the overlooked long-term impact on survivors and the importance of remembering every life affected by this tragedy. My personal favorite here, not really, Arthur Loeb, the fake hero of real tragedies. This was on June 29th, 2024. And I'll say, as an editorial comment, Arthur Loeb is doing a lot of good work for the Eastland disaster, finally, in the afterlife, because while he was alive, he really took advantage. But his story is making the rounds and drawing all kinds of people to my website and the story of the Eastland disaster. In this episode, we followed the unbelievable, and I do mean unbelievable, journey of the charismatic con man, Arthur Loeb. This slippery trickster managed to stay one step ahead of the law until he finally met his match, the Grim Reaper, in the gift shop of the Stardust Hotel in Vegas. Arthur's story adds a layer of intrigue and deception and a bit of amusement into the Eastland Chronicles. The Actor and the Doctor, Converging Lives, Post-Eastland. This was from July 5th, 2024. This is the story of Liverpool-born Tom Milton and Willard Hayes, MD, who both witnessed and assisted the day of the Eastland disaster. Many years later, they would connect again. And this episode also represented my very first bidding on an eBay item. And I'm so glad I got it. And it is the item that is indeed now living at the Newberry. From Hawthorne Works to Heartbreak, Legacy of Loss, July 14th, 2024. Central to this narrative, this episode, is Rosemary Peterzak, who's the granddaughter of Anton Peterzak and Pearl Schultz. Rosemary's mother, Marie Schultz Peterzak, lost a brother, two sisters-in-law, and an infant nephew in the Eastland disaster. Rosemary's story of loss and resilience offers an intimate look of how tragedy impacts lives for generations, but it also speaks to the power of the storyteller, of which Rosemary Peterzak is indeed one. That's everyone for now, and I want to thank you again for joining me each week, as many of you have, to remember the people of the Eastland. We'll continue. I've got a lot more stories. Like I said, we've got 10% down, 90% to go, right? So I will close with a song that I wrote with the assistance of a wonderful application called Suno. The song is called Eastland Hymn.
River deep, so tragic fell Eastland's tale we now do tell. Morning light we say goodbye, tears and sorrow fill the sky. Cities hard in rivers cold, stories lost but must be told. Whistles blow, the silence breaks. On this day the heart it aches. Eastland's call through time it rings. Memory of the pain it brings. Souls we honor, spirits high. In our hearts they never die. Families boarded, dreams ignite. Morning peace it turned to cries. Life so fragile, death so near. Eastland shadow ever clear. In the currents whispers low, voices of the time ago. We remember, we recall Eastland's journey final fall. Eastland's call through time it rings. Memory of the pain it brings. Souls we honor, spirits high. In our hearts they never die. In the currents whispers low,